What you're about to listen to is an amazing conversation where Nance and I, during an epic marathon stream at Theory Underground, brought on Benjamin Studebaker and Nina Power, both of whom are friends of Theory Underground, who have been guests on the channel, and Benjamin Studebaker has guest lectured at Theory Underground. Nina Power will be collaborating with us on the second to last stop of the American Idiot Theory Underground European Tour. And we are currently on that tour. I am recording this from a small town right outside of Brussels in Belgium right now, looking at Nance as he's doing techie stuff on the at the table across from me. And I'm not going to edit out my stutters, and I'm just going to do the immediacy thing and put this straight to press, because we want to publish this right now, because I want anybody who's thinking, oh, Nina, Dave, Nance, this is cool, to go, oh, snap, I can actually attend a real life event in London? That's right. On May 24th, 7 p.m., London. Watch to the end of the video. Check out the PSA about the tour at the end. Or just take the link in the description. Go get tickets now. They will run out. This will be sold out. There is limited space, and we're really stoked to see you there. Peace. Welcome, everybody, to Theory Underground. I'm your host, David McKerracher. Nance here as the co-pilot of this epic marathon live stream. This is part 2. Part 1 is a different video altogether. I've never done a live stream that was going to be so long that I knew ahead of time, oh, I need to actually have 2 separate videos. Because last time, it was the first time we ever did an epic marathon stream. It was so long that the last couple hours got cut off, right? Which meant that certain guests got cut off. Andrew Flores was one of them. And so, I've set this thing up so that hopefully what happened is that if you were watching part 1 live, you've been dumped into the audience of part 2, like a raid on Twitch, but this is on YouTube. So I'm experimenting here. Please, in the comment section, let me know if that worked. But everybody else who's listening to this isn't even watching it live. You're all on podcasts in the future. You're watching this on YouTube as a standalone segment. I posted both of your last conversations with us as standalone videos already. Got some great responses, also some not so great responses recently. But that's right. I am here now with both Benjamin Studebaker and Nina Power. How are you both doing today?
Good.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you both here as well. Now, I didn't know that you both have a podcast. And actually, it was kind of like just a few days ago when I was actually checking it out for the first time. When I actually looked at it, I was like, oh, and Helen Rollins is a part of it. So if I'd known that, she would have been invited here as well. But because I only knew that the two of you were collaborating, I thought, well, you've both been guests here before. I think you're both remarkable people, very interesting, very provocative in various ways, but also you get it in a way I think very few people do. And so I kind of wanted to just start by asking you both to introduce yourselves for those who are new in the audience, who don't know about either of you in your individual or collective work, just to kind of share out a little bit about yourselves and how you came to doing this podcast together.
Yeah. Okay, I'll start off. So I'm Benjamin Studebaker. I did a PhD at Cambridge in politics and international studies. I wrote a book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut. Nina and I got started doing this podcast during a period where the previous political action I had been engaged in was falling apart and had come off the rails. I had been really interested in the Bernie Sanders movement in the late 10s. In 2020, it completely fell apart. And I noticed that so many people in media were pivoting to cultural conversations, which I regarded as a bit of a step back from the political conversation that we millennials had previously been engaged in. And I thought, well, if we're going to talk about films and arts and culture, why don't we do that in a way that isn't so agonistic and nasty, and in a way that's a little bit more pluralist and open to different perspectives and theoretically rich? And that's how we, I think, got going with doing the lab. it was a response to that moment.
Right. Yeah, I'm Nina Power. I'm senior editor at Compact Magazine, which is online for all of your post-liberal needs. And we publish everyone from left to right and mostly centre, though, but we are heterodox and we cover culture and politics and economics and workers' struggles, which the left appear to have abandoned in the main, and so on. I am also a writer and a philosopher. I was an academic for 13 years and I left for various reasons. I'm very interested and supportive and involved in post-academic and or para-academic projects. I still teach a little bit. I teach adult education in London in person at the Mary Ward Centre, and I'm currently teaching a course on evil. And of course, I am evil. Oh, and the LAC. I do the LAC with Benjamin and Helen sometimes. Helen's taking a break for a moment, but we've done more than 100 episodes. And yeah, like Benjamin said, we tried to have this kind of triangular approach. So like the philosopher, the political theorist, and the psychoanalytic thinker and Helen. So we try to look at the same cultural object from these three different points of view. And yeah, it's been very, very fun. I mean, the podcast, I feel like everyone has a podcast. Everyone has a gun to their head. You must have a podcast. I'm launching another podcast next week in New York with Jeff Schullenberger, who's my colleague at Compact, called Blame Theory, which is looking at this kind of move that people make when they say, well, it's all Hegel's fault, or it's all Plato's fault, or it's all postmodernism's fault, or it's all feminism's fault. And this is kind of a move you see often on the kind of slightly griftery kind of, I don't know, online conservative right, I guess, or, you know, like trying to assign blame. So we thought from a Girardian point of view, we would go deep on whether, in fact, Plato, Hegel, feminism, postmodernism, etc., were actually to blame or not for everything going wrong.
That makes me want to listen to it even more than I already did. And I don't listen to podcasts. I don't even want to. And I have multiple. I have multiple, but at this point, I don't even really even remember the time when I was really into podcasts and I was binging them all the time. Like for me, it's just like, no, this is a mode of communication like the phone call, but like conference calls are impractical. And if I want to get like, you know, if I want to share this with everybody, then I have to do it more like a podcast, right? Like, so it is kind of just like, I just think of it as like the phone more than I think of it as like the radio, right? People think, oh, you want to be an influencer, you want to be a micro celebrity. No, I want to have phone calls. You know, it's like, oh, you write opinions in the newspaper. What are you trying to be, a journalist? No, I'm trying to have a voice. Right. And so I think it's kind of similar. Now, that's just me. I want to set myself aside here and kind of change track directions just a little bit. I want to first of all acknowledge the fact that this video I uploaded a few days ago called "Despite Everything, Nina Power Speaks" has received a stupid amount of responses. I don't want to say that all of the responses are stupid. I want to say a stupid amount of responses compared to the other videos that I put up. Right, I put up a lot of videos, put up a lot of segments from these streams that we do. And there's always these people who come around who are like, oh, this is just like what you guys are all about. You guys just don't like trans people, right? And it's like, actually, that is not what we're even talking about, right? It is because Nina has some positions. Specifically, she said the position that there are two sexes and you can't change your sex, right? And that is the controversial issue on the table. And you get some whiplash for speaking to somebody who holds such an outrageous and fringe position, right? So I'm joking, obviously. It's not outrageous and it's not fringe. It's actually, I think, probably the majority opinion in the world. So anybody who cares about a mass movement should probably find a way to handle it. But Benjamin, I want to ask you the first real question here, and that is, so why do you associate with Nina Power? How did you come to associating with her? And what kinds of backlash have you received for associating with her?
Well, I come from Indiana, part of the middle of the United States. And something that became very clear and very obvious to me while I was involved with a lot of the kind of Sanders left stuff in the 10s is that people in universities, people with professional class backgrounds, people who live in big blue Democratic supporting cities are really out of touch with the middle of the country. And yet a lot of the substantive political projects that I found interesting to do with increasing access to healthcare, increasing access to housing, increasing access to education, a lot of these projects require the support of people who don't live in cities and don't have college degrees and don't speak the kind of professional class language that these people are speaking. And so if we want to accomplish things that create time and energy for people, we're going to need to find a way to reach across cultural divisions. And we're going to need to find a way to talk with people who have different kinds of views about social issues in a way that doesn't demonize them, in a way that doesn't exclude them a priori on the basis of their cultural stances. And I practice what I preach, and I talk to people who have different views. And I will make no apology for that. And for people in the comments who think that somebody who takes the view that there are two sexes is therefore necessarily anathema, necessarily right-wing, necessarily a fascist or a racist or what have you, I think that that's a very narrow way of thinking. I think it's very politically counterproductive for them insofar as they're serious about accomplishing economic objectives that will generate time and energy for people in our country. And I think that the fact that they've decided that that's what's most important, Nina's position on sex, that's more important than the work that she did to try to fight against the tuition fee hikes in the UK. The fact that people do this, I think, gives away that they're not really interested in these economic objectives. They don't really care about generating time and energy for people. They're just interested in feeling morally superior to others. And so for that reason, I always ignore people who don't like Nina Power.
Me too. I mean, I try.
I take this to be a sort of litmus test or a filter, actually, as well. Like, and I know I told you, I think, Nina, early on that, like, I'm sorry that you're functioning as a sort of litmus test or as a filter in this underground theory volume, because obviously I wish that people could just engage with you as a human and as a voice and as an intellect who's more than this moment of crisis in the culture. But I guess I want to ask, like, do you think that this kind of intersectionalist approach that has made the issue of where you stand on sex, not gender, but where you actually stand on sex, the defining sort of whether you're with us or against us thing, is this in any way tied to the history of union busting itself, since you brought up Nina's organizing? And like, what might you both be able to kind of say on that sort of idea of this is union busting?
Yeah, I mean, de facto, it kind of is, right? And I agree with Benjamin that this kind of turn to these sort of issues and then the total kind of abandonment and even kind of, I don't know, abhorrence of people who hold views that until 5 minutes ago were perfectly reasonable, including on the left, is well, in practice, it is just the abandonment of the working class. I mean, that is what it does, right? And I think, you know, one of the reasons why I think Compact is so important is that actually you've got people coming from like a conservative background, people who are Catholic, you know, publicly, openly practicing Catholic, who are far more interested in working class struggle and the fight against corporate tyranny. For example, my colleague Sorab Amari has just written a book all about corporate tyranny. We publish pieces endlessly about unions, about the farmers' protests, about things that are happening. In South America, various kinds of populist struggles. We're attempting to try and understand why various populist governments are being elected. And we're trying to give an analysis and an explanation that has a kind of economic and social depth. And all of these things that you know, I associated with the left, right? That they were doing a material analysis, that they had a kind of politics, and also a kind of inheritance from a sort of more Christian socialist tradition, which involved various affects for doing politics, like disagreement and forgiveness and a kind of openness to people making mistakes and so on. And I think all of that disappeared. We had this kind of very, you know, inflexible black and white thinking, the takeover of institutions and groups by a very small number of people who had very, very definitive ideas on what politics should be. I don't even know if it's politics, to be honest. I think it's an expression of certain forms of psychopathology at this point, like narcissism and so on. All of these things that are encouraged by social media in its worst dimensions. And I could see it happening. You know, I was on the left for a long time and very involved in things, and I could see these various, I don't know, like shifts happening, people becoming very unforgiving, public denunciations, open letters. The Me Too thing was used often as just a kind of blunt tool to punish people, often out of envy, often out of a disappointment, and so on, right? And I'm not for a second denying that people are capable of harm. We've all hurt people, right? But there are ways of dealing with harm that are not, you know, where most things don't reach the criminal level, if you see what I mean. You know, most of the time we're dealing with disagreement, disappointment, you know, minor misunderstandings, and so on and so forth. And all of that disappeared. And I mean, I don't think there's a kind of conspiracy to shut down me or anyone speaking in that way, but I think certain kind of pathologies latched on to what these new modes of attack. I mean, they're very old modes as well, let's be clear, but they kind of became a lot of what this fake left ended up doing. And yeah, I mean, the people who went after me are often extremely wealthy, by the way. You know, these are not people who are, I don't know, in any way representative of the working man, right? These are rich people who have latched onto a discourse that they can use to punish people and get a certain kind of enjoyment from that cruelty.
I think that's a good jumping off point into what I was hoping we could get into with the last 35 minutes or so here. And I know this is not fair that we only get this long with you two. I hope that I'll be able to bring you both back for something longer form in the future. And also to the person who said that their criticism of how I platformed Nina was that I ask softball interview questions. I want to say I have a huge problem with this entire approach to interviewing. It's especially common among leftists, right? Oh, the problem with Joe Rogan, or the problem with, it's because he's too softball with his guests. And then you get this, oh, the only way to go on Tucker is to be like that one guy who was calling him out for, his ties to capital, even though he's critical of Davos, he's not critical of capitalism. And so this one guy like exposes the hypocrisy and is basically yelling at him. And they celebrate that as though like that's somehow getting through to people. And it's like, yeah, I'm sure that feels very good in your friend group, but I don't think that disrespect to people that masses of people like look up to is ever really effective, except for shoring in the in-group. Okay, but with that said, I would like to ask you both difficult questions. And that was not really my plan for today. I kind of think we could kind of hedge on some, but the time's not really permitting it. And I think that real difficult questions on complex issues, especially ones that we feel strongly about, are something that you build up to. The relationship has to be there before you get there. And we barely know each other. And so let's just start, with some softball questions, except that these are complex. And the jumping off point was when Nina said that she was on the left for a long time. And I know that in the past, other people have been like, you got to ask Nina if she's left, because it seems like she's not anymore. And then I know that you've said, Nina, oh yeah, well, by 1990 standards, yeah. And, not very long ago, a millennial left, let's just say that. But I think that this brings up a bigger question, and that is the relation of the term left to the term right, and what these two words are functioning as, and how they function for different people in different ways. That really muddies the water, and how they do or do not correlate with ideas such as progressivism, conservatism, traditionalism, liberalism, etc. So left, right, and then we have all these isms. And then I don't know how you both approach this. I don't know if you both agree or disagree on various things. So I kind of just want to open it up. You guys can do with that whatever you will.
Well, In terms of me, I have a little bit of a weird way I like to think about left and right. And it doesn't really correspond with the way that most people use the terms. And for this reason, I wonder if my way of thinking about it is still the way I ought to think about it. But for many, many years, my thinking was that being on the left meant thinking structurally. It meant thinking about how systems, social, economic systems, produce people and produce different kinds of pathologies and behaviors in society. Right? So if you see someone doing something that you don't like, you don't go, oh, that person is awful. You go, why are they doing that? What is it about our society that gives rise to that kind of behavior? And it invites you to view stuff that you don't like as a symptom of something larger. So if somebody cuts you off, instead of going, that jerk, you go, oh, why would that person be in such a situation or in such a mood that they would feel the need to cut me off? And what does that say about the whole thing that we're stuck in? And I thought of the right as the side that does want to blame the individual and say that everything stops at the individual, that ultimately they chose to cut you off. And because they chose to cut you off, you can hold them responsible. You can seek retribution. You can prosecute them through the law. You can be punitive with them. That was how I always saw the difference. It's become really clear that that way of thinking about the terms has nothing to do with the way anybody's using them anymore. And that makes me wonder if I really ought to just come up with a whole different language for myself or what. But insofar as I'm on the left, that's the sense in which I've always thought I'm on the left.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, Benjamin and I often argue over questions of structure and individual in the lack. I don't disagree necessarily with Benjamin's portrayal. I mean, obviously left and right basically come from the French Revolution in many ways. And I suppose the post-liberal diagnosis is an attempt to look at that entire period as where both left and right tendencies fall under the heading of liberalism, right? So that I guess we would associate the free market with the right. I'm certainly not a free marketeer. I am very, very opposed to the economic dominance. In that sense, I'm very close to bits of Marx, maybe particularly the early and middle Marx. And it has a lot of things to do with Catholic social theory and ideas of natural law and what it is, how it is best for the human organism to flourish in community and family and in place, and even what we should eat and how we should stay healthy, and all of those things which are actually completely opposed by free market ideology and the idea that it's all about profit and value and so on, right? This is an inhuman system, right? And the left again used, and it's very interesting, like things like food culture is now associated with a certain kind of right-wing, anti-seed oil kind of bodybuilding thing. But in the 80s and 90s, this was totally a left position. It was like, we don't want to eat corporate sludge. We want to eat bran flakes and, go to the Whole Food store and all of this. So like, that's strange. So there's been lots of kind of political shifts, maybe superficially in some ways. I think most people's politics in reality are actually a combination of so-called left and so-called right positions. And I think the post-liberal perspective, like basically trying to look at liberalism as the overarching structure of both left and right over the past sort of 300 years or so, what it allows you to do, I think, is to see where there are deeper underlying commitments. So whether it's structure and individual, whether it's progress or conservation or preservation or tradition, these are kind of huge historical tendencies.
The program will resume shortly, right after this DIY commercial that is not for any sponsor other than ourselves. Thank you for watching.
Whether we are already fully in the grip of the techno-capital AI singularity or not, we likely feel as though there's not much we can do.
As allies of future generations, we aren't giving up so easily.
To quote the author of Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front, we wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what our life and our children's lives may be.
This fear is not new. The question of technology, media, and institutions became unavoidable in the 20th century. Yet when we think of institutions, the most radical critiques people have encountered came from either Michel Foucault or Jürgen Habermas. These thinkers towered over the theory scene in the 1970s and 80s as radicals took their long march through the institutions.
When it comes to theories of social change, the tendency is to put our hopes in leaving the existing institutions, the current order failing, or some overnight revolution to bring us salvation. Otherwise, we lean in and do the best we can with what's afforded by the existing institutions. Reform or revolution, nothing ever changes, so we keep putting our hopes in education.
So progressives say, if only more people had access to better education, then that would solve the problems. But they have not thought seriously enough about the nature of our institutions, or this thing called education that they offer.
The most radical critiques of schooling that teachers encounter issue from Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, and Henry Giraud, but none of these ever got to the root of institutions themselves. The theorist who did this was Ivan Illich.
Gaining brief stardom in the 70s, Ivan Illich was the father of the deschooling movement, inspiring hundreds of radical schools and generations of homeschooling parents. But this characterization of his work as the anti-school guy was his ultimate demise, for that only takes account of a surface level of his work. Illich was immediately misunderstood and quickly abandoned.
The issue goes far beyond schools. We spend our entire lives mediated through institutions that totalize, instrumentalize, and reduce humans, all of our possibilities, to something predictable, calculable, and exchangeable, easy to control. The interests of state and capital here overlap entirely. Our desires are thus turned into commodities and our time energy into labor power. Illich doesn't stop here, though, for institutions are not the whole picture.
When people think of schooling today, they think of studying for exams, not learning for the sake of learning. When people think of hospitals, they think of treating illnesses, not human-to-human care and well-being. When people think of transportation, they think of speed and efficiency, not the possibility of sustained, regular, and meaningful connections. When people think of reading, they think of collecting information, not lingering with an idea. The move from schooling to schole requires serious inquiry into the conditions of possibility for this mode.
I'm calling for a sincere and earnest revival of Illich. While most introductions to Illich limit their engagement to his earlier works, a series of polemics against schooling and institutionalized consumer society, I want to go deeper and lead us to a more robust understanding of who and what a human is for Illich. With his help, we will reopen the question of what we are, what we can be, and the types of lives we are willing to give our time and energy to bring into being, if there are to be humans in the future.
This course begins on June 13th and goes through July 4th, 2024. It meets on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can enroll at theoryunderground.com/courses/Illich-1, or just click on the link in the description. For those who just want to spend a month really thinking about schooling and institutions, this is a fantastic way to do so. But for those who are looking to go deeper with a community of truth seekers who are going beyond the current theory scene to form an intellectual milieu, this is a fantastic way to do so, because the Theory Underground 2024 conference at the end of October 23rd through 27th is going to have special panels for presentations related to this course. Any student of this course will have opportunities to present, and those presentations can ultimately culminate in submissions that may be accepted into the anthology we are doing on the critique of schooling and education, to be published either at the end of this year or at the beginning of 2025.
Thank you.
We hope to see you there.
Literature of both left and right over the past sort of 300 years or so. What it allows you to do, I think, is to see where there are deeper underlying commitments. So whether it's structure and individual, whether it's progress or conservation or preservation or tradition, You know, these are kind of huge historical tendencies, and even things like that. You know, the left, in many ways, the contemporary left is often very afraid what other people think, right? Like, this is why people leave comments on your YouTube things like, well, even if I don't mind, other people will be upset, and therefore by association, da 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 da. And there's a kind of position there which is sort of to do with the big other, which I think is a sort of structural understanding of things. And I definitely think one of my big breakthroughs in terms of how I thought about structure and individual, and I think about these things somewhere in between, right? I'm neither a structuralist nor an individualist, but I do think if you there's a default tendency, which is a kind of, I think Nick Land describes it as transcendental miserabilism in one of these short pieces, but where
Yep.
to blame capitalism for everything, right? But this becomes a kind of very unhelpful way of thinking about yourself, because everything you do, including addiction, but, you know, not looking after yourself, like behaving badly, then becomes simply like a symptom, because, you know, of your own unhappiness. And it's completely acceptable because capitalism is so awful that why wouldn't you just drink yourself to death, you know? And I think it was probably my experience, ongoing, of course, but with addiction, that actually restored a certain kind of necessity for the need for individual choice, because it's only when you can take back a certain autonomy, and that's a very Enlightenment term, but a certain sense of self-responsibility, a certain capacity to decide for yourself, regardless of the structures or within the structure, right, that you can start to confront some of these issues. And it wasn't until then that I could deal with you know, various addiction problems. And I think this is very common. It's a lot of people have problems with, you know, overeating, drinking too much, taking drugs, whatever, computer games, sex, you know, like we're surrounded by these kind of desires which are constantly being mimetically pumped at us, and you know, it's hard to resist these kind of things. So I think there is definitely a need, at least in my understanding of things, for the idea of conscious individual choice, but it's always within the structure. And if you go too far one way or another, like, you end up in kind of weird and unhelpful places. I mean, same would go for kind of libertarianism as well. Like, that doesn't, you know, help us understand community or relationality. And I think post-liberalism definitely defends and tries to understand the pre-existing relations, like questions of duty, like what duty do we have to our parents, for example? Like, these are huge questions.
Well, and this is a perfect sort of segue, because the love of my life and my wife just entered the chat. She's here now, and she was like, Nina, and everyone was like, Anne. And I just thought that what you were just saying is exactly what Anne keeps saying, as she is trying to sort through the interesting contradiction that we're all in. And that it's like, if you have some basis in sociology and or preferably Marx and critique of political economy and stuff like this, then you are accustomed to not thinking in terms of personal responsibility, right, Benjamin? And that what you just said about how you understand the left, plus what Theo said in the chat, combines to be what I used to say that is the left, which what Theo had said is we need to move beyond capitalism and emancipate the workers equals left. Of course, that is not what it means to most people. In my life, of course, he's in Europe. And so, you know, Europe has a different kind of history with this term. And, you know, Theo and I just had a couple of conversations about this recently. But I would say that basically plus what you said, Benjamin. And so, in fact, that was the thing that put me off the most in my Bernie organizing days, because I had that Marx basis, right? And so I was like, people really like to do this personality politics thing. They really like to go after personalities and assert things from the standpoint of, oh, the reason this has authority is my identity, right? And so like this thing that demonizes humans and doesn't really ever take things to structures, maybe says systemic this, systemic that, but doesn't ever actually get there. It's compelling. I think it's important, but also, as Nina's pointing out here, it becomes a trap at a certain point. It becomes a trap because then we just can't talk to a human as a human who has agency. Like, yes, you're a split subject. Yes, you have drive and you have all of these other things, but also at some point though, we have to be able to connect on the basis that we're humans, we struggle, we mess up, but also we are able to correct. We are self-modulating, modifying, correcting kinds of organisms, right? Well, the reason I bring in Anne here at this point is because in the sociology department, it's almost like that view doesn't exist, right? Of course, they'll say, racism, we're only talking about something structural. It's something systemic. It's not about blaming individuals. It's not about your personal feelings. It's not about your biases or prejudices. It's just about the systemic thing. But then if you don't share their opinion on that, you're responsible for the whole systemic issue. Somehow that turns right back into it's an individual act of racism to not believe in their version of what's going on structurally. And it goes further than that, like where we are teaching in this department, we're both adjuncts there. And we'll say something like, oh yeah, we should tell the student, because we're collectively teaching a course with some other people, and like, oh yeah, we should talk to the students about the clubs, because a lot of them are talking about how they're here because they want to make friends. And like, you get this like instant kind of like, oh, well, not a lot of students can actually find the time and the energy or the money to be able to go and attend the clubs. And you're kind of asserting the ideal student model that we're here to critique in the first place. And I'm like, I just said that we should let them know these things exist in case they can go. I'm not saying everyone can go. But this is just one example of like a whole chain of these kinds of interactions that are making it so that I almost am like, well, I can see how I might just, if I dealt with this long enough, I could see wanting to completely abandon the idea of structures, right? I could totally sympathize with anyone who does, because at a certain point, I'm not talking about everybody. I'm talking about, hey, for anyone who this works for, right? Is this kind of what you're getting at, Nina, when you're talking about how the structure and the individual contradiction makes it so that people, instead of thinking, this is what I think, they're doing this, well, other people are going to think this because you said that.
Yeah, and I think there's a way in which, we're not talking about kind of advanced dialectical structural understanding of structures and the relationship between, I don't know, like the economic system and social forces or whatever. Like when people are invoking structure in this sense, they're basically just abandoning their own critical capacity for thinking, right? And saying, well, other people, like hypothetical others are not able to do this, therefore it's kind of like a strange, almost like a guilt feeling as well. I think is a lot of the time it's like, if I invoke the suffering of others, then I will be a good person. And this is like a kind of classic move. I mean, Nietzsche obviously talks about this a lot, but I think there is a kind of way, it's very hard to think for oneself. I mean, let's be clear, like it sounds really easy, but it's not easy, because we're constantly dealing with what we think other people might think and so on. And it's very difficult to break out of that concern. And in many ways, it's not a bad concern. Like we should be worried about at least what people we care about think. Like we don't want to just blithely behave like some kind of sociopath. Like we do have obligations and duties and care, concern and love for the people around us, hopefully, and they for us, and possibly all we can ever really do is like be slightly better. I mean, this is why Christianity is very interesting, because it sort of accepts the fact that we're always going to transgress and make mistakes and harm each other, but also be harmed, and there's going to be this kind of problem. But we can always try to be slightly better and improve and acknowledge our faults and not indulge them. And to the extent that's possible, we're human after all. But yeah, I think how to put it, there is a kind of almost laziness and a trick almost invoking the idea that other people's suffering mean that you don't have to do anything. You don't have to think. It's just, this is the fact, right? And before, when we used to talk about like structural racism, like the whole point would be to get beyond it, right? Like you don't want people to remain in oppressed subject positions. The whole point is that people in those positions, historically and otherwise, are supposed to emancipate themselves from them, right? And they have done, like in various rebellions and revolts and revolutions. And now we get this kind of bureaucratic imposition of like boxes and identity. No, you will always be oppressed by virtue of being this kind of person. Like that's completely anti-left to me. Like that's not left at all. That's just, I don't know, bureaucratic dystopian horror.
Well said. Well, I think we've got another like 15, 16, 17 minutes here. And so you touched on Christianity, and, you know, Benjamin, I'm sure you've got things you want to say, and I want you to be able to take this in any direction. And Nance, you might have something that you'll want to bring in on this, but I do just want to put the question of religion on the table, because what Nina was pointing out that she liked in this interesting aspect of Christianity, forgiveness and grace, is specifically a functional thing. It's not the actual dogma and its supposed theological basis. It's its actual function, which goes really well with Malcolm Collins, who was on the show earlier. And he's all about the pragmatic approach to religion, thinking about its functional way that it helps mediate evolution and culture. And of course, he's if anybody hasn't watched it already, please go back and watch that when you get a chance, because it's going to become a really important referent throughout this conversation. But you also talked about pluralism at this point. I think you both might have touched on it, but Nina definitely did. And it's like pluralism versus this professional class that's coming out of universities. Goes really well with what Malcolm's talking about when he talks about the monoculturalism that's coming out of cities, and how he says part of the birthing crisis, or what's the word, fertility crisis that he uses, comes down to it's the main ideology of our time. It is that, you know, this monoculturalism, is that the full term he used there, Nance?
Yeah, the urban monoculture.
Urban monoculture is how he says it.
Yeah. And then he related it to wokeness, just to clarify for people that didn't get it.
Right. And he says that it's a mimetic virus that doesn't reproduce itself culturally or through progeny. It insists on taking the children of other cultures and indoctrinating them. And that this is the first time that we've had this on this large of a scale, that is to say, a sort of cult that is so massive and so influential on recruiting everybody else's children to leave their upbringings and become individualist consumers who will not reproduce. And I think that's all very fascinating, but this brings up the question of religion, and I want to just tie it right back into politics. I wonder about is the left versus right? Are these religious categories? Do you think of this? Do you think in these terms, or is there any kind of a relation here? I don't know. I just want to see what kind of sparks will fly throwing all those things on the table there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think energy is so important. If you have energy, then you're able to think in the structural way without it turning into some kind of lazy excuse to do blame and shame through a more complicated route. A lot of the time, the structural language, if you don't have enough energy to carry it through, becomes something that makes you feel like you're doing the right thing, and then becomes a mechanism to praise yourself or to criticize another person. You need a lot of energy to carry through the structural perspective to its conclusion. And a lot of religious traditions, particularly religious traditions that are interested in mysticism or asceticism or monastic life, focus very much on creating a lot of energy, a lot of time and energy to contemplate stuff and think about stuff, so that when you go and participate in the world, when you go and participate in action, it's baked in all of this. And I think part of what is going on here is that we have this relentless assault on everybody's energy. Even the people who go to school, after they leave school, they're then subjected to an enormous amount of stress. They're carrying a bunch of debt. They don't have a lot of choices about what they do for work. Their work is alienating and frustrating and disappointing and atomizing, and it rips them away from their families and communities, everything they've ever known. So in that kind of environment, even if they have some education, they don't have the energy to carry that education through to its conclusions. And that manifests in taking it out on people like Nina. So earlier I said, well, I don't care about people who don't like Nina. That's not true. That I didn't have enough energy there to say what I really think, which is I do care about those people. And the reason that they can't stand Nina is that they don't have enough energy to tarry with this when they listen to Nina talk. And this is why when I do shows, I get a cup of coffee and I drink it so I have some energy. So because we're all the same, all of us, if we don't have energy, we won't quite get it right. We'll have these lapses. And I see the structural thing as something that you're never going to do perfectly because we're all embodied beings with just one body and a limited ability to connect with the outside world. But if we can get enough energy, we can do better. And I think that that's always worth trying and striving to do. And that's why I never give up on the structural emphasis. I'm just always trying to do it better.
Yeah, I mean, let me be clear. I love my enemies, obviously. And that does take some energy. It's much easier to hate them. And I think this is, as Gerard and others have pointed out, one of the great, inventions of Christianity. I'm sometimes wary of using functionalist language to talk about religion because it seems to undermine, let's say, the kind of poetic truths that might be there in religious texts and so on. And the hermeneutics of reading the Bible and other books, maybe not, we can't reduce it to some kind of, oh, well, this works in this way evolutionarily and so on. But at the same time, I think we can absolutely understand religion structurally, historically, economically, materially, and all of these other things as modes of behavior, as a series of stories and insights and even rules and regulations. And I think there is something kind of very significant about trying to get to grips with traditions that are talking about us, right? We're still the subject of these traditions. Like, we haven't advanced to some great other species who are no longer subject to the same emotions and the same pain and the same suffering and the same trials and turmoils. Yes, life has become more comfortable in some ways for many more people, but we still suffer from things like envy and heartbreak and jealousy and sadness and despair and all of these things, as well as great joy and love and beauty, and love of nature and so on and so forth. And yeah, I don't know. I think that there are always various religious revivals going on. And I think the progress cult of the Enlightenment has religious features. Like, I don't, just because it says, oh, we're going to shine a light on superstition and so on. I mean, we can see that people are very dedicated in some quarters to the idea of progress for its own sake, and this is a belief. This is a belief system, whether you think you're going to escape your body or live forever or go to Mars and all these things, this is faith in action.
That point about pragmatism, I think that this is a really interesting argument. And it's one of the differences I see between Adorno and Raymond Geuss, this question about whether pragmatism is a sustainable position that you can have. And Adorno makes the argument that pragmatism necessarily corrodes the kind of belief that you need to have to be religious. And Geuss, I think, is more friendly to pragmatism in part because of the influence on Dewey and his upbringing. But I think that it's also possible, in addition to pragmatism, to potentially take religion in a kind of non-dogmatic way, right? So, in Platonism, the good is the first principle, but it doesn't necessarily have a specific set of laws or principles that descend from it. A lot of medieval theorists tried to add or appendage these things to this idea. But for Plato, any attempt to describe the first principle necessarily only gives you a partial understanding of it because words are themselves an incomplete form of mediation. And if you take this kind of apophatic attitude to the abstractions that are at the heart of religion, I think religion becomes a much more interesting space and a much livelier space, and a space that's a lot more fun when you're not taking those terms to be in the kind of fundamentalist way, which I think oftentimes liberals who go to the city and reject religion will adopt this attitude that all religions must be understood in the fundamentalist way, which people who are cut off from religious education, in the traditional senses of those terms, that's the way they tend to understand those traditions, because they're cut off from them and because they're reading the religious texts alone in an autodidactic fashion without any help. And we don't have to interpret religion in that way. We don't have to be narrow about it. We can be, I think, more open and to a plurality of different approaches and different paths to being a good person.
Do you think that there's a serious conflict, though, between sort of more pagan polytheisms and monotheisms, and that this is, some last century, some last millennia kind of issue that, we can hopefully get over, or is there a way to get over it? Or do you have, I'm especially interested in Nina's response, yours too, Benjamin, but no, I know that Nina's kind of talked about how like losing all of her friends and having to go through all this stuff. Like she started like having a different relationship with the world and the wind and the air and the trees and you're talking all poetically about like how this relationship has changed for you. And it sounded a lot more pagan polytheistic than this sort of monotheistic approach. And considering the fact that we've had a few people on talking philosophy, politics, theology today, I thought I'd at least bring that up. Because you're talking about pluralism. Does monotheism not get in the way of the idea of pluralism?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, there is a kind of Spinozist intuition that maybe occurs when people have a sort of intense relationship to nature and understand like the idea of God as nature and Deus sive natura and Spinoza has obviously this idea of the immanent God, like we are part of the creation, it's not a transcendent God, it's kind of anti-institutional and so on. And I think there's a kind of paganism which is a bit like that, which is sort of like a nature philosophy, if you like. But I think the kind we're seeing a resurgence of a sort of neo-Nietzschean kind of hierarchy, sort of racial differences, whether they're spiritual or quasi-scientific. I mean, I don't think that notion of like hierarchy and strength and brute force and so on is going to go away. I think the opposition between a kind of pre-Christian image of the world as polytheistic, hierarchical, and so on, and a kind of universalist, egalitarian idea of Christianity, which then feeds into liberalism historically. Let's be clear, like the relationship between liberalism is a lot like Christianity without God, right? Like you just basically say everyone's equal, not before God. Like you can decide who or what God is. Right, we're going to make it kind of flat, but it's universal. Everyone can be a citizen. You have like the pursuit of happiness and so on and so forth. So the kind of history of this stuff, the way it feeds into each other, like has to kind of be understood. But I think these tensions are not going to go away. Like we are trapped permanently in a kind of oscillation between a pagan worldview and a Christian worldview. And I don't know. I don't think we're beyond that. Like we're not after that fight.
Do you think Stalinism? This is just like one of those little. It's not even a clarifying question. It's just like, do you think Stalinism was sort of repressed monotheism?
What do you think about that?
Repressed monotheism, as in like that's what was trying to be repressed, or that there was
no. I'm talking about the way that the professional revolutionaries of the early 20th century or the end of the previous century were almost all atheists, very, very like pro-science, often positivistic, even though they were calling themselves dialectical, and that they really thought we can get rid of all religion everywhere, right? And this is part of the wretched of the earth idea from Fanon is kind of just like, hey, actually, there's like all these different divides in these colonized countries you're talking about that do not fit your class, your working class bourgeoisie kind of division, and so the and that's the kind of pluralist complexity response to this. Hey, everybody, it's just the proletariat everywhere versus the bourgeoisie. Let's go. And it's very homogenizing. And that's kind of where I'm saying it's repressed, but it's still monotheistic, right? And this, I said Stalinism, but of course I also mean Leninism. It would count just as much for Leninism.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose just quickly, because Benjamin's probably better on this, but I suppose, yeah, I mean, if you try to overturn God because you think that the institutions are oppressive and that they're selling you a false story of life because, you know, there is no afterlife, there's only this world, then you have to replace it with something, whether it's like universal emancipation of the working class or you know, and yeah, I mean, you can see it in Soviet culture. They have the mechanical opera, like Victory Over the Sun, and you know, this idea that you can kind of defeat nature, not only get rid of God, but defeat nature and invent the new man, and we're going to use technology to do this. And yeah, I mean, it's the Promethean aspect of us taken to an extreme in a kind of post-industrial, well, industrial and post-industrial mechanistic age, right? We can solve the problem of humanity. The fact that this leads to like the bloodshed of millions might make us ask whether this is the right move. I think moving fast generally is not the right move. I think this is generally, this makes me sound like Edmund Burke, and that's fine, but I do think we should not make rapid decisions about who or what humanity is and then change everything on the basis of this like insane whim.
Well, and if you
Well
do
said.
think that there's progress, then insofar as there's progress, people become capable of thinking more and in new and different ways in the future. And therefore, you shouldn't lock those people into a conceptual box that you've made in the past in a previous condition, which may not be as good as the condition that they're in. I think that a lot of people in the Enlightenment era had a kind of notion of the Middle Ages as this time where there was one very fixed, rigid notion of what religion is. And that notion of religion united the whole society organically. And that necessarily when that box of superstitions begins to be deconstructed and critiqued, you need to in some way replace it with something else. And for a while, the attempt is to replace it with Enlightenment reason or a particular notion of freedom. But I think that was always already a bit of a conceit about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was a time when even within the Catholic Church, you had a substantial amount of theological debate. You had, for one, large numbers of saints, large numbers of different sets of virtues, attempts to argue about in what order these virtues ought to be acquired or can be acquired. There's always plurality of concepts and plurality of ways, even in the Middle Ages. And of course, those medieval societies were not very united. You often had civil conflicts in medieval states between different dukes or different lords. It wasn't as if there was a singular totalitarian religion that united everybody together in some kind of straightforward way. So I think that to a large degree, we're haunted by this notion of what the Middle Ages was and an attempt to replicate that, but with enlightenment or with reason, when really, that image of the Middle Ages was always already false. And what we really need is to find a way to tarry with all of the differences in the ways that people think and in the ways that people approach universals. I do think that there are some universals, but I think that people always have conceptualized those universals in an enormous number of ways, and you're never going to bring an end to that because we're all in different bodies. We're all playing, touch the elephant while wearing a blindfold and say what it is. And because of that, there's always going to be a need to retain an openness and a willingness to talk past and, well, not past, but to tarry with distinctions and differences in the ways that people think. And when we start trying to shut that down in the service of establishing a consensus, whether we think of it as a religious consensus or a post-religious Enlightenment rationalist consensus, in either direction, we're not really engaging with the fact that human beings are in different bodies and have to look at the universe from different positions. We have no other way around that. We are looking at the same thing, but we are always looking at it from different positions. And so we're always going to notice different things. And our language will only imperfectly get across what's in our own minds. And what's in our minds is itself incomplete.
And honestly, like, I really want to keep going, and I hope that I'll be able to have you both back on sometime soon. Everyone check out the LAC podcast. And then if either of you have a closing thought or something that you would recommend people go check out based on this conversation, sadly, we're going to have to close this out in a sec.
I think people should read Benjamin's book if they want to understand the current state of American politics, but not only. And I guess like the way in which everybody is falling into political traps from which it's going to be quite hard to emerge, and that we have to kind of hit rock bottom, as they say in the anonymous groups, in order to like see the state we're actually in, rather than endlessly buy into false promises. And I think it's a very useful book for anyone who's thinking about those kind of political and personal and structural and individual and organizational questions and problems.
Well, that's very kind, Nina. I think a lot of people should read your book, What Do Men Want? Because if they read that, they'll realize that you have a position that's a lot more complicated than they think.
Fair enough.
I think everybody should read both of your books. And with that, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day. It was an honor to have you. Take care.
Theory Underground, American Idiots European Tour 2024, coming to a city near you if you're in Europe. Our book tour is taking us all over Europe during the month of May. Theory Underground's American Idiots Tour is about anti-intellectualism in the United States. The US is the world leader in anti-intellectualism and is exporting it to the world via the crises of distraction and exhaustion, two symptoms of this new phase of capital expansion and belligerent state decrepitude. Hear from the Theory Underground crew about the existential and structural possibilities for cultivating intellectual and creative culture for regular working people and university graduates alike. Theory Underground is a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for workers, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they are able to within the confines of academia.
This tour is promoting two new publications from our underground press. David McKerracher's Timenergy, Why You Have No Time or Energy, is about how our job-centric society interferes with self-actualization and meaningful relationships. Starting with the fact that we are all exhausted all of the time, McKerracher builds out a critique between Heidegger and Marx, going on to the schooling system itself and the possibilities for a new approach to technological automation and post-careerist education. Underground Theory, coming to a city near you, includes 31 authors, including big names like Slavoj Žižek and unknown warehouse workers in the US who are students of past courses at Theory Underground. Its main four themes are education, politics, theory, and history, with a big emphasis on critical media theory, how our technological artifacts determine our social existence, and the failures of the neoliberal university. And others, such as time energy theory, the PMC, and post-left political critique, to name a few.
Tour dates: April, Paris and Brussels. By the time you're listening to this, it's too late, but we would have loved to see you here. Berlin, May 10th, 7 p.m., the Psychoanalytic Library, Time, Energy, and Psychoanalysis. In Austria, Linz, May 13th at 7 p.m., Time, Energy, and the Good Life. In Vienna, May 14th, 7 p.m., Time, Energy, and Anti-Intellectualism. Krakow, May 18th, 5 p.m., Post-Leftism and Time, Energy. Glasgow, May 22nd, 7 p.m., Time, Energy, and the Darkest Timeline. London, May 24th, 7 p.m., Anti-Intellectualism, Its Causes. Oxford, May 25th, 2 to 7 p.m., The Consciousness of Time Energy.
The links are in the description. All right, everybody. Looking forward to seeing you on tour. Peace.
Peace. Wu-Tang.